Welcome back to part 4. Thanks for your interest so far. If you're just joining us, what we've done to date is use some macros to create some rows of data that describe events in a match, in this case football. And then we, first with a pivot table and then with some formula, created a bit of a summary table. At the end of video 3, we copied that table to a database sheet, and so a characteristic of a database is that it has rows and columns of data that are very nicely laid out. Now in our case, the key to the success of this database table is going to be these descriptive fields here on the left: player, date, opponent, event, and position. And we pasted our data into that from our summary stats section. What I've gone away and done is add about 25 matches worth of data. So you can see it goes down to row 428, and we've got now a little bit of information to play with. What I'm going to do, the first step, is select everything from row 7 down. Now above that is a couple of headings, and I don't want that included in the table because Excel doesn't like 2 rows of headings. I'm going to convert it to a table, and let's give that table a name. I'm just going to call it TBL data, just to be very simple. And now if we want to begin looking at some information about these matches, we've got a very useful way to start, and that is with a pivot table. So let's try that out. With any cell inside the data table selected, I can choose Insert Pivot Table, put it on a new worksheet, and we get this wizard appear. Let's just do some analysis by player. So if I pull player down into the row area, it starts to build the pivot table for us. Let's put opponent into the columns field. That puts all of the different opponents along the top. And if I just choose one thing, which is overall points, because that's really the performance score that our little system has generated for us, then we've got a grid of data here which is already pretty interesting. I will just right click and choose summarize values by average, because there is some instances where there's more games per opponent than others, and also number format, and just choose one decimal place. On the design tab, I'm going to put in tabular form because I think that's more clean and easy to read. And so what we can see here is that we've got a little bit of a summary table now that looks at how each player has performed against each nation. Now, I just used a random data generating formula, and so therefore there might not be really any great patterns in this data, but if you're using real data, you're going to get some quite big differences between players and opponents for this kind of analysis. Let's go back to our database. Let's try something else. Again, insert pivot table. We could go new worksheet, so we're not getting into any trouble. Putting more than one pivot table on a sheet is fine, but occasionally you just need to be careful. So just for safety, I'm going to put it on a new sheet. Let's try putting opponent and position along the top. Once again, overall points. Once again, I want to summarize by average. Once again, I want to change the number format to a single decimal place. Design tab, tabular form. Now you can't see it on your screen, but over on the right hand side I have created a match identifier, and that consists of just a joined up field, which is the event, which is World Cup, the opponent, and the date. And I've done one for each player as well, which is the name on top of that. Every time you add some data, that's going to calculate automatically, and the value of that is to be demonstrated now. So let's insert a pivot table, a new worksheet again. Just going to label this one match report for now. I didn't label the other ones and it can get a bit confusing after a while. So if I scroll down, the first thing I want to put in is the match unique identifier into the filter. Now if I've got that in the filter, now it makes it quite easy to put the player name in rows, so anyone that played that match is going to be captured by that. I'm going to start with events, overall points, and anything that's got an underscored TPS at the end is one of our category summaries. So we should have 5 of these, and one more which is gain work effort. So we've got 5 categories: an overall summary and the total number of events. Now in all cases they've diverted to sum because that's what pivot tables do. So I just simply want to change them all to average, and also change the number format just to a single decimal place, so it's a bit easier to look at. Also want to tidy up the titles, reduce it down. I'm going to center it up, and just inside the pivot table I'm going to choose pivot table options and untick that box auto fit on update, because I don't want this to blow out again once I add some new data and then refresh. And so we've got an overall average for each player now across all matches, but if I choose a single match, there we have it, a match report that gives us some information about who's performed well. And if I go to the pivot table wizard, now I closed it before, so to bring it back up I've got to go to the Analyze tab. If I put the position underneath the player, it doesn't look so great, but the player under the position starts to look a little bit better. So we've got a positional breakdown, and I can go even further than that, and I can sort descending by overall points, and so we can see the highest performed player in each position group is at the top of that group. Now a little bit of styling on that pivot table can make all the difference, so something like that perhaps. That's a little bit hard to read, so maybe that instead. So there we have it, a little bit of a better looking match report now. So we've got a grand total at the bottom. I can at any point choose a different match and everything updates. So it's looking quite nice, and certainly there hasn't been a lot of effort required to build that up. And so I've just named these other pivot tables as well. But what I'm going to do is on all 3 of them I'm just going to choose height, so that they're just out of view for now. And if I go to insert pivot table again to a new worksheet, I'm going to pull that into rows and copy that. In my config panel, I'm going to paste it just somewhere convenient, create a little list that we can do with a drop down box. So if I select all of that, just call it list of matches, I've now got the opportunity to go and build something that I really want to look at with formula. I'll call it match report 2 because we can't forget that there's some hidden sheets there that have got that match report name. So I'm going to start off with the F3 key on a PC. I can go to my list of names, and I know I just created one called list of matches, and so there it is there. Can't really see it that well, so I'm going to expand that all the way out and just merge that cell so I can choose and see my matches easily. For now I'm just going to color it yellow so I can see it very clearly when I'm going through this process of building. Now the easiest thing to do to get us started is to go back to our config panel and pick our entire name list. Let's put in some of our headings, and we could write formula that would populate that report out. And so that's what we just saw with a pivot table, and on its own not a huge amount of value, but what you do get out of doing it with a formula is the ability to create something cool like a dynamic chart that looks at one player at a time and a profile of how they played that particular match. And what's even better than that, as we will see shortly, is the ability to reference this data against some other information. So I'm going to populate this out. How might I do that? Well, it's not particularly complicated. There's only one value for each player for each match in our data table. And so it doesn't matter which option we choose. We can do sum if or average if, and it'll give us the same information. I prefer sum if because average if doesn't like 0, so In fact, it's some ifs because we have two criteria. The criteria are player and match. And so the first thing we have to put down is our sum range. If I type TBL data, it pops up, gives us a list of options, and we have got events as a field there. So these table references make it quite easy to write these formula. Our first criteria is that the player needs to equal whatever's in A7, and if I just choose the $ in front of the A, then I get a bit of comfort that I can copy that across. Next one is we have to scroll all the way to the bottom because I put our unique identifiers right at the end. UI match needs to equal whatever's been selected up here, and I double lock that with both rows and columns. Copy down is easy, don't have to do any work for that, and pasting it across, a little bit of editing and I will be ready to go. And so just with some editing of that one original formula, double clicking and sending down, tidying up, I would change this to number, 1 decimal place, and center it just because it looks nicer that way, and I don't know, a little box around it. And we've now got what we got from that pivot table previously, and that is a dynamic little report showing what happened in that particular match. If we go to our config panel and we have a look at our list of players, there's something called list names here. So already there, we've created that already, so that we can now go and use that again on the data validation tab, choose list, hit the F3 button, or simply type list of names. Let's just choose one at random, same as the other one, make it yellow just so we can see it. And with a VLOOKUP, we want to look up this player's name. Where do we want to look it up? In this table, F4 that. What column index are we looking to find? Well, pass is in column 4, so I'm just going to manually type that in because that's the fastest way. And if I drag that across, I simply have to go through and update that VLOOKUP. We could write a formula that would be clever and adjust for us, but again, let's just take one step at a time and not get too carried away. And so we've got the correct numbers coming through, and this now allows us to insert a, let's just say, a column chart, and we could put a little combined title which looks like this. And if you don't know what that char 10 means, I did a video on it not so long ago, and what it does is it allows you to have a carriage return or a new line in a label or a title. So if I hit enter, it doesn't look like anything's happened here, but now when I click on the title and reference to that cell, we get a name and then UI match identifier underneath that, and I quite like that. So formatting my data series, I'm going to make my gap width a little bit smaller because I like that, and I'm also going to, as much as possible, format my grid lines so that they are the lightest shade of grey I can find, because you don't really want them distracting you from actually the message. It might be that you don't even need to see that data. That's up to you to decide, but there you go. We've got a little dynamic chart here that shows us what's going on with each player, and we can now pick matches and so on, and everything is updating, giving us some quite nice looking information. Not a bad option perhaps to add a data label. Again, that's a preference thing. I like them, not everyone does. And so we've got this in place now. There's one more thing I want to have a look at before I knock this lesson on the head, and that is to say, well, actually we've got good info there, but why don't we dial it up a little bit more and put in some extra reference information. Alright, so there's 4 different reference options that I've just typed in there, and we need a way to extract those things out. And so before we can do that, we need a little bit of help. And I'm going to do it all on the sheet, even though it's going to make the sheet look rough. What I want to do is a bunch of things that assist us in writing a formula. So the first one is we need to find out what position Jimmy Greaves is. So we need to VLOOKUP. What do we need to look up? Whatever our selected player name is. Where do we need to look it up? Now we've got a table called player details, and if I'm not mistaken from previous videos, I think our position is in column 2, so we know it's midfield. Next thing we need to do is we need to use index to find out the opponent. We can see by reading it that this is USA, but we can't extract that out and use in a formula without a little bit of help. So we need to write an index function. What do we want to look up? We want to look up a table called TBL data and extract the opponent name. We do that by using the match function to look up this unique identifier in the data table using UI match with an exact match. That's only going to find the first correct answer, but that's good enough. And so the overall match average should be easy enough to find. That's just a single criteria average, which is average if. What's our range? TBL data. Everything needs to use as a criteria field just that UI match. What is our criteria? Well, it's up here. Clicked in A4 because that's our selection option, and the only thing that's going to change is the field that we are averaging. And so first up we're looking at passing, and so I called that PP underscore total points, and I can close that off. I'm going to just do that offline, dragging that all the way across. But let's say we also want the position average for that match. So this is a little bit different. I can copy that, paste it down here, do an average if. Excel does something a bit weird here, and that is it changes the order of the functions inside the formula. And so now you actually need to put that bit first. And so we're looking for total points for that match, but also with a second criteria. We need to just find that for our midfield position. Now let's find what the player's average is. This is just another average if. We need to, using player as our criteria, find out what the total points normally is. Now finally, just the opponent average. We could do the player opponent average as an extra one, or just the overall opponent average. So let's just do the opponent average on its own. And we're now done. So we can see that generally speaking against this opponent things go pretty well. So we've now got some data here. I'm going to populate that out with all the other options, and we can look at how you can overlay these options on your chart. And so we now have those averages, and if we check a different reference, we can see they all update. So I should be pretty confident that that's all right. Now if I just do a little sort of mock-up here now, if we create a list and we choose our reference points as the options, we can pick what we would like to see. And so let's say we can now choose our overlay line. If I just go under here and say equals VLOOKUP, I choose that. I select these cells, and just like before, we have 4 as our first option. If I drag that across, a little quick column update, and we've got everything we need. Just for tidiness, I'm going to put that down to a number. But now what we can do, and I'll leave it visible for a second, is add another data set. Series name is going to be match average or whatever we've selected there. So that's why clicking on that cell is the way to go rather than simply typing it in. Select our cells. Okay. And so what we have there is another bar appeared. I prefer not to do that. So I want this one to actually be a line with markers. And if I format the data series and take away the line and just dial up what that marker looks like, we've got actually what I consider a reasonably useful reference point without it dominating the chart. So we can look at a different reference that's going to move, a different player now that's going to move, and like I said before, you might actually be happy to hide that away, and you'll probably hide this away as well. And so we've got two little sections in our analysis here. The player data itself and your reference data. You could add various reference options to that. But I just like to think that you can get a little bit of insight now by choosing how you want to compare the player and obviously picking the player in the match that you want to look at. So this is rough looking, it's not very tidy, but you get the gist of things. Being able to extract the data out and then apply reference values is kind of the key to performance analysis and giving players good feedback. Come back for the next lesson, there's still a few more things I want to show.